Uh, my talk is on integrality and embodiment in Sri Aurobindo and Jean Gebser. Jean Gebser gives us a philosophy of history which looks at emergent structures of consciousness as forms of relative concealment and unconcealment of what he calls the ever-present origin. In this, he can be said to follow Heidegger's reinterpretation of Hegel, the first modern philosopher of history. Instead of Hegel's historicism, Heidegger had put agency back in the human and acknowledged being as setting up the horizon and confronting beings who find themselves in their thrownness responding with language, the house of being, through which its horizon discloses and undiscloses itself. This existential turn in Heidegger stands Hegel on his head and confronts him with Nietzsche. Gebser gives this Heideggerian creative praxis, erigness, an anthropological concreteness in seeing the signs of these evolutionary stages of human ontological mutation in the archaeological record. Arriving at the mental structure, Gebser goes through several stages leading to the development of perspectivism. Perspectivism implies objectified thinking, pathways from ignorance to a vanishing point of gnosis. There can be infinite such pathways, which is why the Bengali saint of Dakshineshwar said, "There are as many paths as there are opinions." Yet, if the pathways proliferate, they run into each other and find themselves having to cohabit uncomfortably. They do so through social structures. These social structures inevitably disintegrate due to ever finer perspectivisms. There will be some natural confederations, but there will be a great step when humanity at large realizes that the vanishing points of all perspectives is the same and has independent reality. This is the integral consciousness. According to Gebser, this independent reality of integral consciousness was across the horizon of being for the mental structure. Now, as this structure, at least in potential, reaches its culmination, the mentally impossible ideals begin to become possible to experience due to the independent reality of integral consciousness. According to Gebser, from the mid-19th century, the integral consciousness has begun being intuited in all the arts and sciences. He is most comfortable talking about visual culture. This is expected given his characterization of the age in terms of perspective. Perspective is a visual ontology, thus a spatial one, but one which includes and subordinates time. In contrast, music can be thought of as belonging to a temporal ontology, to which space is subjective experience and shaping. However, the integral is the aporetic event or location where all space and time are present in each point. This is what gives to it its special ontology, which to Gebser has the objective qualities of transparency and diaphaneity. The transparent, again, is a purely optical quality, though indeed one may adapt this easily, and we hear, for example, of transparent sound. Meaning sound so natural you cannot hear the mediation of technology or its perspective. Here transparency means the presence of truth, either unmediated or mediated by something which makes itself invisible. Gebser uses the term diaphaneity also to refer to integral consciousness. I take it he is not referring to a mediating instrument as being diaphanous, but integral consciousness itself as having this property. This would imply gradations within the integral consciousness. I take it that diaphaneity refers to the presence of all possibilities at each point. The coexistence of all time implies a transparently accurate palimpsest of history, spatially appearing as a translucent density a diaphaneity. Closer contact with this consciousness reveals the space dimension to be a door, opening to a holographic dimension of a continuity of discrete events with fuzzy borders, the presence of time, with all space known only through eventuation. Living in this presence is what Henri Bergson refers to as duration. Deleuze sees this as the basis of intuition, duration as primary intuition, the living presence of the past and future. This, possessed in its concrete fullness, is the knowledge of the three times, Trikal-drishti. What, according to Gebser, must we do to embody this consciousness? I believe the first step is the reversal of primary dimension from space to time. To move to the acron, we have to move from spatiality to temporality. Space with time present but subordinated is perspectival consciousness. The modality is thought as projection, planning. In its place, Gebser suggests becoming aware of the creative presence of history, pressing towards the future, and conscious of the coexistence of all space and time in our space and time. We are creative agents of history, and each of our actions has world effects. This is not a way of thinking, but an intuition of being, leading to an ontology, the integral. Moments of integral consciousness can come upon us unexpectedly, but the practice of the intuition of duration is achieved, according to Gebser, through intensity. Intensity implies the concentration of many possibilities, both synchronically cultural and diachronically historical. But though one can intuit the dimension of integral consciousness philosophically and catch glimpses of it in experience, to what extent can we think of our times as expressing the integral consciousness? As Gebser may have us think. Holding this question, let us turn to Sri Aurobindo, in whom Gebser saw a like-minded visionary, perhaps even a mystic from whose pervasion, vyapti is a Sanskrit term, Gebser himself received his intuitions. In a 1979 publication, Gebser has written, "Be it noted that my concept of the formation of a new consciousness, of which I became aware by a flash-like intuition in the winter of 1932-33, and which I began to put forward in 1939, largely resembles the world scheme of Sri Aurobindo, who was then unknown to me. My own, however, differs from Sri Aurobindo's in that it appeals to the Western world only and does not have the profundity and the pregnant origin of his ingeniously presented conception. I see an explanation for this phenomenon in the fact that I was in some way brought into the extremely powerful spiritual field of force radiating through Sri Aurobindo." Unquote. Sri Aurobindo's notion of integral consciousness belongs primarily to his yoga psychology, which is also a cosmology or a psychology all the way down. Integral consciousness is used by him to describe the supramental consciousness, which is one of his coinages. What I spoke of earlier as the knowledge of the three times, Trikal-drishti, is certainly a feature of this consciousness. But this is at a higher than cosmic level, a level to which the laws of the cosmos, including the iron law of death, are creative choices. Instead of looking at what Sri Aurobindo calls integral consciousness, it may be more appropriate to look at what, if anything, Sri Aurobindo may have to say about the transition from the mental structure, or even more germane to us, from the modern age. Sri Aurobindo's social and political philosophy is to be found in his book, The Human Cycle. It sees time in terms of the Hindu procession of yugas, but he does not see these as circular. In other words, repeating exactly the same patterns or events ad infinitum. He sees them as ontological time cycles. Thus, such a set of ontological developments forming a relative cycle may be seen in the time scale of the Gebserian cycle of mutations of consciousness leading from an archaic age to an integral age, or each of these mutations of consciousness could be read in terms of such a time cycle sequence. The Puranic image of this sequence is that of a diminishment in quarters of a circle of plenitude. The number 4 plays a very important role here, as it does in Gebser's cycle 2, which can be seen as a system of 4 plus 1. The Satya Yuga, or the age of truth, has the full circle of truth. The Treta has 3/4 of the circle, the Dwapara has half the circle, and the Kali has 1/4 of the circle. We are supposed to be in deep Kali now. Many schools, however, believe that we are in a Yuga Sandhya, or twilight age, between the Kali and the new Satya Yuga. This in itself implies a spiral idea, each cycle leading to a greater one with the same structural progressions. Sri Aurobindo has his own reading of this succession. In the hybrid light of the German philosopher Karl Lamprecht, 1856 to 1915, he translated these yugas into the terms of a diminishment of symbolic truth, but a progressive increase of individual self-consciousness. The yugas translate in his language to a symbolic age, a typal age, an age of conventions, and an age of individualism. Sri Aurobindo's symbolic age refers not to the symbol-making property of humans, as in Gebser's mythic structure, but to a spontaneous embodiment of a spiritual symbolic reality. Such an embodiment is, however, individually unconscious, like the organs of a body that operate unconsciously, but in spontaneous harmony under the law of the body's autopoiesis. The rise of self-consciousness causes reflection on the characteristics of the symbolic realities and a consequent reification of the flexible symbols into types. Thus, the typal stage is characterized by a dominance of ethical concerns, with all else subordinated to these. In Indian society, it was best expressed in the ideal and concept of dharma, the upholding of tradition, and the fulfillment of one's social position and responsibility. The epic Ramayana best exemplifies this stage. In the conventional stage, which is the next one, the outward expressions of the ideal overshadow the ideal itself, such that customs, outward signs, and symbols become ends in themselves, and their inner spirit and significance becomes eclipsed. In its early phase, the spirit and inner significance of the social institutions still live and thrive within well-developed structures. But afterwards, the institutions become more and more formalized and artificial, and their inner purpose and significance becomes obscured. In Indian society, this is illustrated with the growing rigidity of the caste system in which the society was organized, with its increasing emphasis on custom, heredity, and ritual. The society depicted in the epic Mahabharata is a good example of this. We just heard the Gita mentioned, which is from that epic. The age of individualism develops out of the conventional age as a reaction to what is felt as its imprisonment by the spirit of the human. There may be some comparison between these ages and Gebser's structures. The symbolic age may correspond to the archaic structure, the typal age to the magic structure, the conventional age to the mythic, and the age of individualism to the mental structure. But making such comparisons may defeat the purpose of the taxonomy in both cases. Clearly, Gebser's structures refer to social ontologies based on a relation to the ever-present origin, while Aurobindo's are a progression in self-consciousness. Gebser didn't like his structures to be looked upon as evolutionary stages, while for Aurobindo, there seems to be a cosmic determinism at work here, not necessarily an evolution, but still a psychological process to time. Yet, if one reads Sri Aurobindo closely, it is also clear that though the cosmic dice is loaded in each case, it is the play of world forces and human agency which together determine the transitions from age to age. Such a view can be contrasted with that of Hegel, for whom the zeitgeist or time spirit was the primary agent, with human beings only acting out its dialectical experiments. It was in fact as a reaction to such historicism, downplaying human freedom and creativity, that Nietzsche posited the will to power at work everywhere in acts of domination or subordination, but finding its true expression as the will to self-exceeding in the overman. Michel Foucault, who was self-avowedly a Nietzschean, like Gilles Deleuze, his friend, proposed a view of temporal phases or epistemes, similarly characterized by different relationships to the construction of knowledge as an act of power. What concerns us primarily in this discussion is our present times. Reading Gebser, one may call this a transition point from the perspectival to the integral structure. In Sri Aurobindo's reading, the age of individualism arises due to the awakening of a further degree of self-consciousness, to which the social conventions and taboos of the past seem like imprisonments. As with Gebser, the most recent such shift from a conventional to an individualistic age occurred, according to Sri Aurobindo, on a world scale, or more properly on a scale which led to a world consequence, the birth of geopolitics and world history, with the European Renaissance. Following the Renaissance, the Enlightenment pushed the age of individualism into its characteristic episteme, what Sri Aurobindo calls the cycle of reason. Interestingly, we see a clear convergence with Gebser's thought here. Since the invention of perspective, one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance, launches modern humanity into the perspectival phase of the mental structure, something which finds philosophical articulation and epistemic validity with the Enlightenment. But instead of a transition from this phase to an aperspectival integral structure of consciousness, Sri Aurobindo delineates two intermediate phases, making the completion and supersession of the cycle of reason. The first of these is the subjective age. Once again, there is a convergence with Gebser, since Sri Aurobindo also identifies the subjective age as taking its first steps around the start of the 19th century, moving into its characteristic expression from the middle of the 19th century till the early 20th, and promising to lead onto a deeper spiritual age as the 20th century progresses. It should be noted that Gebser was 30 years junior to Sri Aurobindo and resident in Europe, where he had ready access to the exciting changes in culture that were part of modernism in all the arts, sciences, and philosophies from the early to mid-20th century. He wrote his magnum opus on the ever-present origin in the late 1930s, the heyday of modernism. Sri Aurobindo, on the other hand, wrote his human cycle during World War I, 1914 to 1920. Sitting in a remote corner of India, where the cultural currents of contemporary Europe were hard to come by. Thus, the examples he provides for the transition from a rational age to a subjective age belong to an earlier period, the mid to late 19th century, mainly in England, and drawing mostly on poetry. We see these examples not in the human cycle, but in a work of literary historiography, The Future Poetry, where he surveys the history of English poetry in order to show a transition towards a new kind of speech, capable of conveying spiritual experience through the heightened use of its fused powers of rhythm, vision, and thought. He sees the forerunners of this trend in the Romantic poets of the early 19th century, but he sees better examples arising towards the end of the century. The names he gives us include some who enjoyed considerable popularity in their lifetimes, but have since disappeared from sight. The British poets George Meredith, Stephen Phillips, and Edward Carpenter, and some who are adulated to this day, Walt Whitman and Rabindranath Tagore. Though Sri Aurobindo demonstrates interesting departures in all these cases, the radical changes in modernist poetry inaugurated by the French symbolists or in the Anglo-American world by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound are missed out by him. In his later letters on literature, he did, however, discuss the symbolists and on occasion Eliot, and spoke of preparing a new edition of the future poetry in which he would address the modernists shortly before he passed on. Like Gebser, who saw the signs of the integral structure in the modernists, Sri Aurobindo saw his moderns as initiating the transition to the subjective age and preparing the ground for a spiritual age. Modernism, whether in art, poetry, music, or science, certainly opened the doors to new ways of experiencing reality, and hence can be thought of as a harbinger of a new ontology. Since Gebser's metaphors are worded in visual terms, we can see how, in the visual arts, modernism from post-impressionism onwards drew inspiration from non-Western cultures to collapse perspective and express a new relation to reality, which was clearly subjective. The proper material for expression became not the object world separated from the subject, but the world as existent within the subject, shaped and colored by subjectivity. Yet, 40 years since the passing of Gebser and 60 years since the passing of Sri Aurobindo, high modernism is no longer seen as a paradigm-changing initiation, which has taken us into either a spiritual age or an integral structure of consciousness. Today, modernism is periodized and relativized as an era of heroics. When the creative individual believed that she could change the world but failed. The causes of this failure lie mostly in the hubris of modernism itself, its emulation of modernity's sense of rupture from the past, in thinking of a perpetual revolution taking us into ever new dimensions of experience by the Magus-like power of the creative agent. But such a rupture remains alienated from the mass of humanity, subject to the mundane forces of techno-capitalism. I mean, the mass of humanity is subject to the mundane forces of techno-capitalism. And the modernist magi have rarely, if ever, demonstrated a power of personal life that gives evidence of a higher than ordinary consciousness. And as Michel Foucault has pointed out in his late works, the need of our times is not the production of valorized artworks to be speculated over in the art market by the likes of collectors, museums, art journals, and art critics, but the application of a micro-political creativity to one's own life. The demonstration of a power of integrity that challenges conditioning factors but is attentive to its own soul-making as a relational project, something he calls subjectivation. If modernism has not been the Moses' rod to part the Red Sea and lead us into the promised land, some today see our present phase of globalization as validation of the Gebserian integral structure or the Aurobindian spiritual age. Another thinker along with Aurobindo whom Gebser acknowledged as sharing a family resemblance, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, is more often addressed in this regard, a non-localized global consciousness available in a material sense through contemporary telecommunication. This very conference, a good example of a local event with its dynamic spectral double in cyberspace, constituting the noosphere, a kind of cosmic consciousness which is presently supposed to be available to all of humanity. This relation has been forged in no small measure by the powerful poet and philosopher of media technology, Marshall Mcluhan. Mcluhan's adaptation of Teilhard's noosphere in the technological key has substantially contributed to the vision of cyberspace as a kind of cosmic consciousness / integral consciousness. Indeed, the argument can be made and has been made that the principal properties of divinity, omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, are within the reach of every man today. One can contact any point in the globe with one's cell phone. It's an omnipresence. One can increasingly access any information pertaining to any subject from any period of the Earth's history through the press of a button, thanks to Wikipedia. And one can control events and objects remotely in more and more powerful ways, a kind of omnipotence. Yet, there are two problems with this godhood. One, it is sustained and driven by capital for the production of capital. And as such, its principal object is in creating a control society of conditioned subjects whose choices in work, relations, and pleasures are commodified and subordinated to the world market. Two, it is out there, but not in here. The first of these problems is one of hyper-perspectivism, the yoking of humanity to a single grand perspective, that of capital, served by the corporation and the nation state. This is the age of the world picture of Heidegger, not the spiritual age of Aurobindo or the integral age of Gebser. The post-colonial scholar Trin Minha has pointed out how modernity lures its subjects with the promise of freedom, but turns them into slaves of capital after tearing them from their historical roots. Increasingly, one finds neoliberal clones marked by their name-branded merchandise, albeit in increasingly proliferating varieties, which appear to validate multiculturalism, but are in reality only flavors churned out by a global desiring machine. The second problem is even more fundamental. It is the difference between having and being. Having access to a global condition is quite different from being global or having a global consciousness. The images proper to such a condition are those examples such as a hive of ants efficiently carrying out the functions of the totality through invisible control, a multitude of fools who can't distinguish between gold and tinsel, or a bunch of apes seated in front of a console of buttons in a nuclear facility. W.B. Yeats ends his poem Leda and the Swan about the improbable and violent coupling of God and woman with the lines, "Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop?" A new world condition demands the production of a new subjectivity, which can equal the epistemic sense of this world. Do we have global agency in this world? What knowledge can we muster to confront the forces of global conditioning? For an answer, we have to return to Gebser, Aurobindo, and others, whose writings are not primarily predictions, but intuitions, aspirations, and guidelines for praxis. Among contemporary thinkers, it is Gilles Deleuze who has honed in on this issue as the central one of our times. How can we as individuals find a power of consciousness to equal that of the world machine? This question is not posed by him as a duality, but as an inextricable braiding. Deleuze re-engages with the Nietzschean dream of the overman, seeing this being as a body without organs and a practice of nomadology, micropolitically engaged with the triple folds of organic genetic codes, inorganic intelligence, and the essence of language as the roots of affect below the threshold of conventional signification. In Sri Aurobindo, we find an adaptation of the theories and practices of ancient yoga traditions assimilated to a similar purpose, not meditation for stress-free management, or yoga for the packaged healthy lifestyle of the yummy mummy, or as a badge of nativist identity politics, but intuition, vijnana, to interpret and bend the idea forces that shape our world. The power, Shakti, to make the highest creative and revolutionary uses of the global energies. The refusal of biopolitical conditioning through the discovery of new powers of the body. The expansion of consciousness into true cosmicity and the entry into the house of the three times, Trikal-drishti. This is the embodiment of integral consciousness. Such skills of consciousness must be individually practiced and taught in contemporary wisdom academies at every level. For this, new scholar practitioners and new post-secular and post-religious languages and pedagogies must arise. It is only at the distant end of such a praxis, co-engaged as a creative agent in our global condition, dominated by capital, that we can say that the promise of the integral structure of Gebser or the integral consciousness of Aurobindo are no longer illusions or worse, fatal mistakes, but the very meaning of the challenge of our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Debashish. We'd like to open up the floor for 5 to 10 minutes of questions and answers.
a quick comment, and that is Eric Kramer, who's not here, had traced Mcluhan's work to Gebser and showed that that Mcluhan had written Gebser, Fred Gebser, I mean.
Interesting.
I don't know.
Thank you. No, I was not aware.
That makes sense, though, doesn't it?
It does make sense, yes, absolutely. I think there is a kind of a sort of a constellation of thinkers who were definitely drawing from the same energy, and they drew on from each other as well. In some cases, actually, in some cases in an occult fashion, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's it's a key focal point. Not the content, not the information that's delivered, but the technology, the technique that it's being thought through.
Right.
The media as the way of thinking, not the content of the media as thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Your second issue that you brought up about technology and globalization, I think points to an interesting human phenomenon in that when we come from a consciousness of separation, we tend to project into the world something that we're trying to understand internally. And perhaps this whole globalization, internet connectivity is, like the development of the computer to understand how our brains work. We're developing the external technology so that we can understand the internal technology, but we have to make that leap into the unification of external and internal so that we can indeed come to the full internal power that we have for and already always being connected. And I think it's I don't know much about this university, but I think and hope that it's that leap back to developing an internal technology for this kind of connectivity for that issue to take us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the basic point I was trying to make, which is that it's this sort of in a sense, the Enlightenment is already a kind of a telos, has its telos in what we've reached right now. It's already predicted right there. That's what we are aiming for. It's the exteriorization of a global consciousness. But that becomes an entity in itself unless we can internalize it, you see. So that's what it's all about. Internalizing it is seen as impossible for the Renaissance because the human being is already predefined. We're already a finite being with finite boundaries. But as far as, the whole teaching of Sri Aurobindo or Gebser is concerned, we are mutable beings who are capable of moving from one structure to another and expanding into the cosmos, in fact. So that's what really this whole thing is about. That can we be the world that we've created, not just have it, but be it.
Yeah, and then develop our capacity
to
go up north a little bit to SRI and learn how to do remote viewing.
Sure.
You can access the Akashic records, those sorts of things that are just kind of on the fringes now. We've brought to a more central.
Sure.
Thank you, Lisa. One more question? Jeremy.
Actually, it had first a note from what Michael was saying earlier. William Irwin Thompson also did a kind of cross comparison between Gebser and Mcluhan. I think in the book Coming Into Being, I think he opens up the book talking about how Mcluhan's medium ages, print or oral or electronic, kind of related or connected to Gebser's own structures. But just like a sort of additional thought about these technologies, because I'm also doing a presentation on it later. I really liked what you said, because I'm wondering if you think that, yes, we're outering our consciousness. We have interconnectivity and omnipresence and omniscience with all of this, but are we really embodying that? Do you think that the fact that we have all of these technological outerings or mirrors is a sign or an indication that we're getting closer, that origin, or that this integral consciousness is approximating, a kind of breakthrough, a kind of foreshadowing?
Yeah, and it's a very interesting question. And actually, these things have many dimensions to them. And Deleuze, for example, who talks about the fold, in his later work, he's talking about the superfold. And he's saying we're at that point. The superfold, essentially, the fold is the inside, the outside, inside, right? So it's the complication of the inner-outer relationship. And often it is the outside that is prepared first. And then the engagement of the human with that really creates the ontology. The ontology is not yet here. It's an invitation. But if we don't take it in that light, so it ultimately becomes a project of consciousness. Depending on how you take it, you can turn it into a success or a failure. So it could be a big failure if indeed we become conditioned by that. But if we expand ourselves to equal ourselves with that, then it becomes a new age. That's basically.
Thank you.
So this thing about talking about Teilhard, for example. Some people have looked into his writings, and he says that there is a process of new genesis. The new sphere comes into existence through invisible processes, but new genesis will be followed by Christogenesis. And Christogenesis for him means that humanity will become aware of this cosmic consciousness and then will embody it, become the Christ, which is the cosmic consciousness in every individual. So I think that really, in a sense, is the promise, if we can live it, if we can carry it out.